She won't even see it coming. She never does. I would think.
Very carefully, before you read another word.
Everyone believes a servant sees nothing. They never realize. A servant sees everything.
You believed no one important was watching. You were wrong.
In a manner gilded on the outside and hollow within, everyone believes the family's ruin has finally been undone by a duke's signature on a marriage contract. Valeria's mother speaks of the wedding as though it has already happened. Her father counts the dowry before the ink has dried. And Valeria, she has learned that in this house, her silence is the only thing that still belongs to her.
But the Duke has a secret.
Rather than arrive as the powerful man his title promises, Hadrian Ashcroft comes early and unseen. He trades his crimson sash for a servant's plain black coat, hides his signet ring in his pocket, and steps into her world wearing a footman's cap and a stranger's face. Hidden behind a gilded pillar, a silver tray balanced in his hands like armor, he listens. And what he hears is not the calculating woman he braced himself for. It is a conspiracy whispered in silk and perfume, aimed straight at the one person in that ballroom who has done nothing wrong. By the time the chandeliers dim tonight, an entire room will believe they know exactly who Valeria is.
By the time they burn bright again tomorrow, a duke will stand before her and prove every single one of them wrong.
Because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with fanfare and titles. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a servant's disguise, watching from the shadows until the moment it can no longer stay silent.
Tell me in the comments, who do you think is really being deceived tonight?
The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a rider whose horse had clearly not stopped once between the capital and the crumbling gates of Whitmore Estate. Valeria remembered that detail long after everything else blurred the way the animal's flanks heaved, the way the seal on the envelope caught the grey morning light like something alive. Wax the colour of dried blood. The Ashcroft crest pressed into it, sharp and final. She was in the east wing when her mother's voice cracked through the house like a whip.
Valeria! Valeria, come down at once!
She set down the ledger she'd been hiding from her parents for months, the one filled with numbers that only grew worse the longer she stared at them, and made her way through corridors that had once gleamed, and now merely peeling gilt, water-stained silk. A house wearing the memory of wealth like a widow wears her husband's coat, long after it stopped fitting. Her mother stood in the drawing room, clutching the letter to her chest as though it might combust if she let it go. Her father paced. And her sister, her lovely, untouched younger sister, sat perched on the arm of a chair, eyes bright with hunger. Valeria had learned, over 23 years, never to trust. It's done, her mother breathed. It's finally done. The Duke of Ashcroft has agreed. Valeria felt the floor tilt, just slightly beneath her. Agreed to what, mother? To the marriage, you foolish girl. Her father snatched the letter and thrust it toward her, his hand trembling with something that wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite fear. To you. Ashcroft has agreed to marry you.
The words landed strangely, not like salvation, like a verdict.
She read the letter twice before the ink stopped swimming. The language was cold, contractual, precise dowry terms, estate obligations, a wedding date already fixed as though her opinion on the matter was a formality too small to bother requesting. Her signature was expected. Not her consent. Just her signature. The estate is saved, her father said, and for a moment his face did something Valeria hadn't seen in years. It softened briefly, gratefully, before hardening back into the mask of a man who had simply solved a problem using the only asset he had left. Her sister rose in a swirl of skirts, already halfway to admiring herself in the mirror above the mantel. A Duchess in the family, she murmured, delighted, as though the title might somehow drape itself over her instead. Do you think he's handsome, Valeria? They say he's terribly severe. Terribly rich, though. That forgives quite a lot.
Valeria said nothing.
She had learned in this house that her silence was the only inheritance no one had yet found a way to sell. She excused herself before her mother could see her hands shake. In the hallway alone, she pressed her back against the cold plaster and allowed herself exactly one breath of something like grief for the life she had quietly imagined for herself, small and unremarkable and entirely her own, before folding it away, the way she folded away everything that could not be afforded. She did not know the Duke's name beyond the crest on the wax. She did not know his face, his voice, the shape of his cruelty, or his kindness. She only knew that in 3 weeks she would stand before him at a ball meant to formalize what her family had already sold, and that whatever he was, she would have no choice but to become his. What she could not have known, what no one in that fading, desperate house could have known, was that 200 miles away, in a study far grander and far colder than her own, a man was staring at that same contract with an expression of pure, quiet refusal. Hadrian Ashcroft of pure, quiet refusal. Hadrian Ashcroft did not trust contracts. He trusted them least of all when they concerned his own life. He stood at the window of his townhouse study, the marriage agreement spread across his desk behind him like a corpse awaiting autopsy, and watched the city below go about its indifferent business. Somewhere in that fading countryside estate was a woman he was expected to marry, a woman whose name he knew, whose dowry he'd been briefed on, whose face he had seen only in a stiff, formal portrait commissioned specifically to flatter. He did not trust the portrait either. "You could simply arrive as yourself," said his steward, Callum, from the doorway, arms crossed, already anticipating correctly that Hadrian intended to do nothing of the sort. "Announce your carriage. Let them prepare a reception befitting your rank. It is, Your Grace, generally how these things are done."
That, Hadrian said, is precisely the problem.
He turned from the window. There was a restlessness in him that had nothing to do with impatience and everything to do with a decade of learning, the hard way, that people showed you their truest selves only when they believed no one important was watching. He had built his fortune on that principle, testing men before trusting them, watching how they treated servants, tradesmen, the powerless, before he ever extended his hand. It had never once failed him. "If I arrive as the Duke of Ashcroft," he said, "I will be shown a performance. Curtsies rehearsed. Smiles arranged like place-setting. I will meet the woman they have prepared for me to meet, not the woman she actually is." Callum's mouth twitched, somewhere between admiration and exasperation. "And what, precisely, do you intend to do instead?" Hadrian's gaze drifted back to the contract, to the date circled in his own hand, to the ball that would gather half the aristocracy under one glittering roof, 3 nights from now, the very event meant to introduce him to his future bride, formally, publicly, irreversibly.
"I intend," he said slowly, "to arrive a day early, unannounced, unseen."
"What?" Hadrian almost smiled. Almost. As no one at all. The plan, once formed, moved with the same cold efficiency he brought to everything. A footman's uniform, plain, dark, unremarkable, procured quietly through a household contact who owed him a debt he'd never once mentioned collecting. A false name, simple enough not to arouse suspicion, forgettable enough that no one would think to question it twice. His signet ring, the one piece of himself he could not entirely disguise, slid from his finger and into an inner pocket, where it sat against his chest like a secret with a heartbeat. Callum watched him dress in the servant's coat with the particular horror of a man witnessing his employer commit a mild but deliberate act of madness. "If you're discovered," Callum said, "there will be no explanation that does not end in scandal." "Then I won't be discovered." Hadrian adjusted the plain white cravat at his throat, nothing like the crimson sash and gold epaulets that usually marked him instantly as untouchable, and studied his own reflection with something like grim satisfaction. Stripped of rank, he was simply a man. Dark-haired, sharp-jawed, unremarkable in the way that made servants invisible to the very people they served. That invisibility, he thought, was exactly the point. And if she is precisely what the portrait suggests, Callum asked. Beautiful, biddable, eager for the match. Hadrian's expression didn't change. Then I will have lost nothing but a day. But if she is something else entirely... He left the thought trail unfinished, because even he did not yet know how to complete it. I would rather know the truth before I bind myself to a lie. He arrived at Whitmore a full day before the ball was meant to formally introduce them, not through the grand front gates, where a duke's carriage would have drawn every eye in the household, but through the service entrance at the rear, where deliveries were made, and no one thought to look twice at another hired hand brought in for the extra work an event of this size demanded. The house staff, overwhelmed by preparations for the following night's gathering, barely glanced at him. One more pair of hands. One more face to carry trays and polish silver and disappear into the walls the way servants were trained to do. It was, Hadrian thought as he shrugged into the borrowed coat properly for the first time, disturbingly easy to become no one. The corridors behind the grand rooms of Whitmore moved like a separate world, entirely narrow, hurried, thick with the smell of beeswax polish and roasting meat, and the particular anxious energy of a household trying desperately to appear wealthier than its ledgers allowed. Hadrian fell into step behind a line of footmen carrying silver trays toward the main hall, mimicking their posture, their pace, the particular downward tilt of the eyes that servants adopted to signal they saw everything and noticed nothing. He was handed a tray before he'd even asked for one crystal glasses, pale gold wine catching the candlelight, and a curt instruction from an overworked housekeeper to mind you don't spill on the good rugs. They've precious little else left that isn't threadbare. He filed the comment away. Precious little else is left. Interesting. The tray settled into his hands with a weight that felt strangely grounding. He had commanded armies of servants his entire life without once considering what it cost to carry something so carefully across a room full of people who would never once look at your face.
Now he understood.
He moved through the service door into the main hall for the first time and nearly stopped walking entirely. The room beyond was vast, gilded, lit by chandeliers dripping crystal like frozen rain, and utterly unlike the quiet countryside decline he had expected. Someone had clearly spent money they did not have to make this room glitter for one night, to convince 200 guests that the Whitmore fortune was merely resting, not dying. And there, near the centre of the room, speaking with a composure that made the chaos around her seem to organise itself into orbit around one still point, was a woman he recognised instantly, despite the portrait's failure to capture a single true thing about her.
Valeria!
She wore ivory silk that had clearly been remade from something older, the embroidery along the bodice hand-stitched with a care that spoke of desperation dressed as elegance. Her dark hair was pinned in an updo threatening, ever so slightly, to escape its ornamental pins as though she'd dressed too quickly, or hadn't had a maid skilled enough to secure it properly, and simply decided not to let it matter. She held a crystal glass she wasn't drinking from. Her spine was straight. Her expression from across the room looked serene. But Hadrian had spent a lifetime reading rooms for the lies dressed as calm, and he saw it immediately, the tightness at the corner of her mouth, the way her eyes flicked, just once, toward her mother's overbright laughter with something that might have been exhaustion, or grief, or both. She was performing. Beautifully. Effortlessly. The way only someone who had been performing their entire life could manage. He retreated behind a gilded archway near the edge of the room, tray balanced against his forearm, and told himself he was simply observing his future bride as any prudent man would. He was not entirely convincing himself. For nearly an hour, he watched her navigate the room the way a soldier navigates a minefield, smiling at guests who condescended to her family's fortune, deflecting questions about the impending marriage with answers vague enough to satisfy without revealing, steering her mother gently away from conversations that threatened to embarrass them both. She refilled an elderly guest's water herself when a servant was slow to notice. She knelt, briefly, ivory silk pooling against the floor, to retrieve a dropped fan for a child no one else in the room had bothered to acknowledge. Small things. unnecessary things. The kind of things a woman did not do for an audience because no one of consequence had been watching. Except him. Something in Hadrian's chest shifted, quiet and unwelcome, like a lock turning that he hadn't given anyone permission to touch. He was still watching, still cataloguing, still telling himself this was reconnaissance, and nothing more when her younger sister approached with two other women Hadrian didn't recognize, their heads already tilted together in the particular formation of people who had begun speaking of someone before that someone had arrived.
He shifted his tray, angled himself deeper into the archway's shadow, and listened.
Truly believe she'll manage him. One of the women was saying low, delighted, the words dressed in silk but sharp underneath. As if a man like the Duke of Ashcroft would ever be satisfied with someone so plain. So terribly serious. Valeria's sister laughed, soft and cutting. She's convinced herself it's about duty. About saving the estate. It's rather sweet, really, how she still thinks anyone will thank her for it. And if he discovers the truth of things before the contract is finalized? The second woman asked, and something in her tone made Hadrian go very still. If certain, letters were to find their way into the wrong hands? A man like that won't marry a woman he believes capable of deceit. He'll want a reason to withdraw. We simply have to give him one. Hadrian's grip on the tray tightened, the crystal glasses trembling faintly with the motion. You still have them? Valeria's sister asked, and there was no laughter in her voice now, only calculation. Safely, the second woman said. Forged well enough that no one will question them. A letter suggesting she's been otherwise engaged. Enough to make him doubt her virtue, her honesty, her worth. He withdraws the offer in disgust. The match falls to someone more deserving a pointed, meaningful pause, and Valeria is left with nothing but the ruin she spent her whole life trying to prevent. She won't see it coming, the sister said, and there was something almost gleeful in it now, something that made Hadrian's jaw clench so hard it ached. She never does. She's too busy trying to save everyone else. Hadrian stood behind the gilded archway, a tray of crystal glasses balanced in hands that had gone perfectly, dangerously still, and felt the entire architecture of what he'd expected to find here collapse and rebuild itself into something else entirely. He had come to Whitmore braced to discover a calculating woman disguising greed, as duty a bride eager to secure a title through whatever means necessary. He had come prepared to protect himself. He had not come prepared to discover that the woman he'd been sent to judge was the only person in this glittering, rotting room worth protecting at all. The conversation dissolved into laughter as more guests approached, the conspirators smoothing their expressions into pleasant nothing with practiced ease of women who had clearly done this before, dressed cruelty in courtesy, handing betrayal to each other over champagne like party favors.
Hadrian did not move from the shadow of the archway for a long moment.
Across the room, Valeria laughed at something an elderly guest had said, genuine, unguarded. The first entirely honest expression he'd seen cross her face all evening, and the sound of it reached him even through the noise and the distance and the disguise he was still, absurdly, wearing. He thought of the contract on his desk, of the portrait that had told him nothing true, of Callum's warning about the scandal and how thoroughly he had already decided it no longer mattered. Somewhere behind that gilded pillar, holding a tray he no longer felt the weight of, Hadrian Ashcroft understood with sudden absolute clarity that he had not come to Whitmore to evaluate a bride. He had come to find out exactly how much danger she was already standing in, and precisely how far he intended to go to make certain it never touched her at all. The letters, he thought grimly. He needed the letters, and he needed proof of who had forged them. Before tomorrow night's ball gave her enemies the stage they were so carefully building toward. He had one day.
It would have to be enough.
Hadrian did not sleep that night. He returned to the modest inn he'd arranged near Whitmore, still wearing the ghost of the footman's coat over his shoulders, though he'd long since shed the cap, and sat by a single candle, turning the truth over and over in his hands like a coin he couldn't decide whether to spend. He had come to judge a woman he'd never met, prepared to find in her every convenient assumption his rank had ever taught him to expect. Greed. Ambition. A calculating heart wrapped in silk. Instead, he had found a woman who knelt for a child's dropped fan when no one of consequence was watching, who steadied her mother's missteps with a patience that cost her something visible in the tightness of her jaw, who laughed once, briefly, honestly, in a room built entirely on performance. And he had found, waiting in the dark behind her, two women plotting to destroy her with forged letters and rehearsed cruelty, simply because her ruin made their own ambitions easier. He thought of Callum's warning. Scandal, if discovered. He found, turning the thought over, that he no longer cared what it cost him to be discovered, only what it would cost her if he arrived too late to stop what had already been set in motion. By the time dawn touched the windows, Hadrian had made his decision with the same cold clarity he brought to matters of far less consequence. He would not simply expose the plot. He would let it unfold just far enough to strip his enemies of any place left to hide, and then he would burn it to the ground in front of every witness who mattered.
He sent for Callum before the sun had fully risen.
"I need everything you can find," Hadrian said, already writing, on a woman named Miss Delphine Harcourt and on Valeria's own sister. Correspondance. Debts. Any forger known to work in this county who might have been paid to imitate a young lady's hand. Callum, to his credit, did not ask why the Duke of Ashcroft was still dressed as a footman at this hour, nor why his voice carried an edge Callum had rarely heard from him even in matters of business. "And if I find nothing by tonight? Then I will stand in that ballroom with only my word against theirs," Hadrian said. "But I intend to arrive with more than my word." He returned to Whitmore before the household had finished dressing for the evening's grand event, the very ball meant to formally introduce him to his bride. The one his own family had spent weeks preparing for, unaware their Duke had already spent a full day watching her without their knowledge at all. He resumed the footman's coat. He resumed the downward tilt of his eyes. He became once more no one at all and used that invisibility exactly as he'd intended. Moving through corridors and kitchens and hurried conversations no one thought to lower their voice around, because servants were not meant to matter enough to listen. By late afternoon, Callum's rider arrived with a slim leather folder that Hadrian opened with the particular stillness of a man confirming what he already feared to be true. 3 of them, in a hand that mimicked Valeria's careful script closely enough to fool a casual eye but not closely enough to fool a man who had, on the last day, watched her sign her name to a guest ledger with his own eyes. The forgeries curled their letters differently, rushed where hers was patient. Confident where hers, even now, carried the faint hesitation of a woman unused to being believed. Beneath the letters, a second document payment records, carelessly kept, linking a struggling local printer to a sum of money paid by a name Hadrian recognized instantly from the previous night's conversation behind the archway.
He had his proof.
He had, he realized, considerably more than that. He had a decision to make about exactly how public he intended his revenge to be, and standing there in a borrowed coat that no longer felt like a disguise so much as armor, Hadrian Ashcroft decided that whatever happened tonight, it would happen in front of every single person who had ever underestimated her. The ballroom, by the time the evening properly began, had transformed into something almost unbearably beautiful, chandeliers blazing, gold trim catching candlelight until the whole room seemed to shimmer like something not quite real. 200 guests moved through it in silk and jewels, voices rising and falling in the particular hum of a society that fed on spectacle the way other creatures fed on air. Valeria stood near the centre of it in a gown of champagne and cream, gold embroidery catching the light with every small, careful movement, and felt the entire evening pressing down on her like a held breath. Tonight, formally, publicly, she would be presented to the Duke of Ashcroft. Tonight, her future stopped being a rumour and became a fact. She did not know he had already met her. She did not know he had already chosen her. She only knew the whispers had started earlier than usual tonight, small clusters of guests breaking their conversation the moment she drew near, glances that lingered a beat too long before sliding away. She had spent her whole life reading rooms the way sailors read weather, and something in the air tonight tasted wrong. "You look pale," her sister said, appearing at her elbow with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Nervous, I imagine." "Understandable, given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" Valeria asked.
Her sister's smile only widened, and she did not answer.
Across the room, near a cluster of gossiping matrons, Delphine Harcourt watched Valeria with the patient satisfaction of a woman who had spent weeks building toward exactly this moment. She touched the folded letters tucked discreetly into her reticule insurance. She'd called them privately, though insurance had never before required forging another woman's hand, and waited for the precise instant the room's attention would be most concentrated, most hungry, most willing to believe the worst of a girl who had spent her whole life trying to disappear into usefulness. She did not have to wait long. The murmurs began at the edges of the room and moved inward the way fire moves through dry grass, quiet at first, almost polite, and then gaining a terrible momentum of their own. Valeria noticed it the way one notices a temperature change, a chill settling over conversations that stopped the moment she approached, a new sharpness in the glances thrown her way, something building toward a point she couldn't yet see. "They're saying," her sister said, feigning reluctance so thoroughly it was almost convincing, "that certain letters have surfaced. Letters written in your hand, Valeria. Concerning an attachment. Before the Duke's contract was ever signed." Valeria's stomach dropped. "There are no such letters. I've written no such thing to anyone." "Of course not," her sister said, in a tone that suggested the opposite entirely, and drifted away to let the rumour do its work without her fingerprints anywhere near it. Valeria stood very still in the centre of a room, turning slowly, inexorably against her, and felt the ground she had spent her whole life trying to secure crack open beneath her feet. She did not yet know that somewhere near the edge of that same room, behind a gilded pillar, a man in a footman's coat had gone rigid with fury, watching the trap close exactly as he'd predicted and waiting, with the terrible patience of a soldier who has learned that timing matters more than speed, for the precise moment when interrupting would do the most damage to the people who deserved it. Delphine Harcourt did not wait for the whispers to reach their natural conclusion. She had learned, over years of careful cruelty, that rumours left too long sometimes lost their momentum, and so, with the theatrical timing of a woman who had rehearsed this moment more than once in her mirror, she raised her voice just enough to carry across the nearest cluster of guests. "I do think it only fair," she said, "that Miss Valeria be given the chance to explain herself before the Duke arrives and discovers the truth second-hand, through no fault of his own." The room's attention swung toward Valeria like a physical force. "Explain what, precisely?" Valeria asked, and was proud, distantly, of how steady her voice remained, even as her pulse hammered violently against her ribs. Delphine produced the letters with the reluctant sorrow of a woman performing regret she did not feel, holding them just high enough for the nearest guests to glimpse the familiar curl of handwriting without quite being close enough to examine it properly. "I found these," she said, "quite by accident. I confess I did not know what to do with them. They suggest, forgive me, I only say this because I care for you, that your affections were engaged elsewhere before this contract was ever signed. That you agreed to marry the Duke, knowing full well your heart belonged to someone unsuitable. Someone beneath your family's station." A gasp moved through the nearest guests like wind through wheat. "Those are not my letters," Valeria said, and heard with rising horror exactly how such a denial sounded to a room already primed to disbelieve her. "I have written no such thing to anyone." "Then you won't mind if they're read aloud," said one of Delphine's companions, stepping forward with the eagerness of a woman who had been waiting all evening for permission to enjoy herself.
"I mind a great deal," Valeria said, "because they are forgeries."
But the word forgery, spoken by a woman suddenly and publicly accused, sounded exactly like what a guilty woman would say, and Valeria watched with the particular helplessness of someone drowning in full view of a crowd too entertained to throw a rope, as faces around her hardened into judgment before a single letter had even been unfolded. "Poor girl," someone murmured, not quietly enough. Desperate, I suppose, given the state of her family's finances. One can hardly blame her for trying to secure a husband any way she could, though forging her own affections is rather a novel approach. "The Duke will withdraw the moment he learns of this," another voice added, with the particular relish reserved for other people's ruin. No man of his standing would tie himself to such deception. Valeria's mother appeared at the edge of the gathering crowd, face ashen, already understanding with dawning horror exactly what these rumours would cost the family if they took root before the Duke's arrival. Her father looked, for the first time in Valeria's memory, entirely without words. "These are false," Valeria said again, louder now, though she could feel the room's belief slipping through her fingers like water. "I do not know who wrote them or why, but I have never." "Read them then," Delphine said, unfolding the first letter with theatrical care, "and let the room judge for itself whether these words could possibly belong to anyone but you." The paper caught the candlelight. The room leaned in, hungry, delighted, ready to watch a woman's reputation dissolve in real time, and Valeria stood at the centre of it with nowhere left to run, no ally close enough to intervene, no proof of her innocence beyond her own increasingly desperate voice against a room that had already decided her guilt made a far better story than her honesty ever could. It was in that exact moment as Delphine's mouth opened to read the first damning line aloud, as 200 guests held their breath in anticipation of a woman's public destruction, that a voice cut across the ballroom with the cold, absolute authority of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. "I would think very carefully," Hadrian said, "before you read another word." The room turned as one. He had shed the footman's coat entirely. He stood now in the dark, commanding a tailcoat of his true rank, gold epaulets catching the chandelier light, the crimson sash across his chest announcing exactly who had been standing among them, unnoticed, for longer than anyone in this glittering room could have possibly imagined. His jaw was set. His eyes, when they found Delphine Harcourt across the stunned silence, held a particular stillness of a man who had already decided her fate and was simply choosing, generously, to let her understand it first. "Your Grace," Delphine managed, the letter still frozen in her hand, "we did not expect." "No," Hadrian said. "I imagine you did not expect a great many things about this evening." He crossed the room with unhurried, deliberate steps, and the crowd parted for him the way water parts for something far heavier than itself. He did not go to Valeria first, though every instinct in him screamed to put himself immediately between her and the room's cruelty. He went, instead, directly to Delphine Harcourt and extended one hand.
"The letter," he said. "If you please."
She surrendered it without seeming to decide to, hand trembling now in a way it had not trembled while she'd been enjoying herself moments before. Hadrian examined it for exactly as long as was necessary to confirm what he already knew, then held it up not to read, but to display, the candlelight catching the ink at an angle that made the mismatched, rushed penmanship glaringly obvious even to guests who had no particular expertise in handwriting. "I have spent the last day," he said, voice carrying easily across a room that had gone utterly silent, confirming what should have been obvious to anyone willing to look closely rather than gleefully. This letter was not written by Miss Valeria. It was forged, and rather clumsily, I might add, by a printer in this very county. Paid a sum of money I have documented in full, by a woman standing in this room tonight. Delphine's face was drained of colour entirely. "You," Hadrian continued, turning to face her fully, "along with an accomplice or two I have not yet finished identifying, constructed a plot to destroy the reputation of a woman whose only crime, as far as I've been able to determine, is possessing more integrity in one evening than this entire room has managed in a season. Your Grace, surely you cannot believe. Delphine started. I do not believe, Hadrian said. I know. I have the payment records. I have the forger's confession taken this afternoon under considerably less flattering circumstances than this ballroom offers you. And I have, he added, voice dropping into something colder, sharper, a full account of a conversation I overheard behind a gilded archway 2 nights ago, in which you and Miss Valeria's own sister discussed, in some detail, exactly how you intended to ruin her before this contract could be finalized. The gasp that moved through the room this time was not entertainment. It was horror, and it was aimed, finally, in an entirely different direction. Valeria's sister went white as a bone. You were, Delphine's voice cracked entirely. You were the footman. The one carrying the trays. There were many things this week, Hadrian said, that I did not announce publicly. But I assure you, Miss Harcourt, I saw and heard every moment of what you believed no one important was watching. He turned then, finally, fully, toward Valeria, who stood in the centre of the room she'd been drowning in moments before. Ivory silk trembling faintly with the force of her own held breath, eyes wide with an emotion too complicated to name in the space of a single glance. I came to Whitmore a day before I was expected, Hadrian said, and though he spoke to her, his voice carried to every corner of the silent ballroom, disguised as a servant, because I did not trust a portrait or a contract to tell me who you truly were. I expected, if I am honest, to find confirmation of every assumption my rank has ever taught me about women bartered into marriage for their families' fortunes. He crossed the last remaining distance between them, close enough now that she had to tilt her face up to hold his gaze. Instead, I found a woman who knelt in silk to retrieve a child's fan no one else thought worth noticing. A woman who steadies everyone around her while receiving no steadying in return. A woman targeted tonight not because she has done anything wrong, but precisely because her integrity made her an inconvenient obstacle to people who have none of their own. Valeria's breath caught audibly. I do not withdraw my contract, Hadrian said, loud enough now for every guest, every whispering matron, every calculating rival in that gilded room to hear with perfect clarity. I confirm it. Publicly. Tonight. Not because a piece of paper obligates me to, but because I have watched you closely enough, these past 2 days, to know precisely what kind of Duchess you will make, and precisely what kind of woman I intend to spend the rest of my life protecting. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the room erupted not into the cruel murmurs of moments before, but into something closer to stunned, reluctant awe, guests already recalculating their opinions with the swift, shameless agility of people who had learned which way the wind now blew. Delphine Harcourt was quietly, efficiently escorted from the ballroom before the evening's dancing resumed, her schemes unravelling behind her in a trail of confirmed forgeries and abandoned alliances. Valeria's sister, pale and cornered, found herself the sudden object of exactly the scrutiny she had spent the whole plot trying to redirect elsewhere. Her role in conspiracy laid bare, in front of the very society whose good opinion she'd been so desperate to secure through her sister's ruin. Valeria stood in the centre of it all, Hadrian's hand steady against hers, and felt something inside her chest, something clenched tight for as long as she could remember, finally, carefully, beginning to loosen. You disguised yourself, she said quietly, once the worst of the room's attention had scattered into 100 separate, urgent conversations, as a footman. To watch me. To know you, Hadrian corrected gently. There is a considerable difference. And if you had found exactly what you expected, the calculating woman your rank warned you against, then I would have withdrawn quietly and never once told you I had come at all. His thumb moved, slowly, against the back of her hand. I did not find her. I found someone considerably more dangerous to the life I had planned to live without you in it. Valeria laughed, soft, startled, entirely unguarded. The same honest sound he'd first heard across a crowded ballroom 2 nights ago, and known, even then, he could not stop wanting to hear again. The wedding, when it came weeks later, bore almost no resemblance to the cold contractual arrangement that had once summoned a rider across 200 miles to deliver a sealed verdict disguised as salvation. Whitmore's ballroom had been repaired properly this time, its gilding restored not through desperate performance but through the quiet, steady wealth of a match built on something considerably sturdier than debt. Valeria's parents, humbled by how close their own blindness had come to costing them everything, stood somewhat awkwardly at the edges of a celebration that no longer required their careful management to survive. Her sister was absent entirely, her role in the conspiracy having cost her, rather than a season's embarrassment, a quiet exile to a distant relative's household, far from any ballroom where her ambitions might find fresh ground to root in. Delphine Harcourt's name, by contrast, had become a byword for exactly the kind of cruelty polite society claimed to abhor and privately adored discussing. Her invitations quietly withdrawn from every household that mattered, her carefully built reputation dismantled with the same thoroughness she had once attempted against Valeria's own. Hadrian stood at the front of a church filled not with the glittering, hungry crowd that had once nearly destroyed her, but with people who had watched, in the weeks since that ballroom's revelation, exactly what kind of woman Valeria truly was: steady, generous, quietly formidable, in ways that no forged letter could ever hope to counterfeit. When she walked toward him in ivory silk far finer than anything she had worn before, but somehow less armoured than every gown she'd ever donned for a room that judged her, Hadrian felt the same lock in his chest that had first turned behind a gilded archway click, finally, fully open. "No disguises left," Valeria murmured when he took her hand. "None," he agreed. "Only the truth of what I found, watching you when you believed no one important was looking at all." They built, in the years that followed, precisely the kind of marriage that had seemed impossible to Valeria the day its sealed contract arrived, one built not on bartered debt or convenient arrangement, but on the rare, deliberate choice of a man who had gone looking for deception and found, instead, a woman whose quiet integrity had rewritten everything he thought he knew about power and worth and where true nobility actually lived.
If you were Valeria, standing in that ballroom with the whole room turned against you, would you have trusted a stranger's silence to save you? Or would you have fought alone until the very last moment?
Tell me below, because somewhere out there, another disguised truth is waiting to be uncovered. And I'll be right here to tell you exactly how it unfolds, if you stay close enough to catch it.